Okay, so we'll work on the brain bit for a little bit longer and then we'll be done for today. So, any questions? So, you've got these biases around anxiety, that baseline. What's fascinating is we now know that based on your baseline sense of anxiety, that's actually the best predictor of whether or not your marriage will last. That is crazy. But people with a high baseline level of anxiety have unstable marriages. I'm going to wonder why. It has nothing to do with that. It's just they're triggered easily emotionally, they're highly reactive. That is, as far as we know now, the single best indicator of whether or not you're going to have a divorce. Other indicators are things like whether or not you have children, that's a high indicator. Age at which you married, that's another indicator. Whether or not you're devout religiously, that corresponds inversely. That is, the more devout you are, the less likely you are to. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of stuff, but this turns out to be critical. The best predictor is whether or not you have that baseline anxiety. If you do, now, who has the high baseline anxiety? I'm not sure what the models are. I think it's about 20% of people have that genetic combination. And then there's another 20% who have the opposite. Nothing phases them. Nothing at all. They're the ones who are walking out in the street going, they'll stop, it doesn't matter, I'm just doing stuff, you know, life is easy and it's good. Even when it isn't, they're still saying that. They just have the very low. And then about 60% of the population in the mid-level. And it's genetically cued. It's really fascinating. Now there are apparently more genes now that we're discovering that are involved with that baseline anxiety as well. There are about 7 now. But there's one core one that, and you have to get, the high one, you have to get it from both parents to have the high. Anyway, it's interesting stuff. Okay, so you've got anxiety that drives you deeply. It's a deep bias, survival-oriented anxiety. Another issue you have in your brain is pessimism bias around trade-offs. That you have a tendency to think that if I trade this for that, I will lose. Even if you will gain. Even if your skepticism, anything I have is better than anything I could have. That is, trading equivalent for equivalent doesn't feel like equivalent. I have to be trading for something considerably better, or I don't feel I can trade for it. I feel like I'm losing. Isn't that bizarre? It's really, really hard to assess equals. Your brain goes, what you've got is more important than what you could get. Unless it's really quite significant. There are lots of ways of manipulating that, but it's a pessimism bias around trade-offs. I really have to offer you something significant. Bizarrely, you've got an optimism bias when it comes to your personal actions. You have a tendency to overrate your own abilities to do anything. That is, we all believe we're above average. Our abilities to, it's really wild. If you try and get people to assess their abilities relative to other people in terms of doing something, everybody thinks they're above average. That's optimism bias regarding our personal actions. Again, we're also deeply sensitive to social cues. One of the reasons why I really like having students sit in a circle is because you learn more if you're more aware of each other. That is, if everybody's facing me, you literally learn less. That is, the teacher-student dynamic is not what socially cues learning. It's a student-student dynamic that socially cues learning. It's really bizarre, but it happens to be true. Okay? It's because of the way we're very deeply oriented towards our social context, our peer context, to tell us what is right and wrong to do. So very quickly students figure out, intuitively, unconsciously, who are the smart students in the class, and they pay more attention to them about what's really going on. And when those students go, woo, then everybody else goes, wah, because they're cueing often that there's something important going on. Okay? And then they just open themselves up to learn more. If they're just staring at the instructor, they don't know what's going on. They don't know what's valuable to learn or not. You know, I start talking about restaurants in Vancouver that I love. Is that important? Answer is no, but how do you know? How do you assess? Where is the guy going? Well, you look for the smart students and how are they responding? They're going nodding off. Oh, it's just the prof wandering again, you know, does that. Cause and effect thinking. This is a horrible one. We have a terrible tendency to want to find a cause that leads to the effect. We're always dealing with effects. We want to know what the cause is. We want to understand a nice, simple progression that leads from A to B. What was in between? So we can understand it and deal with it and even potentially manipulate it. The problem being that life doesn't work that way 90% of the time. Cause and effect is a ridiculous simplification of almost everything. Now, it works for simple things, habitual things, things that we know about, but if you really want to understand something, you cannot use cause and effect thinking. You have to use systems thinking, which is what a mind map is about. You have to look at the pieces and how they're interacting with each other, because otherwise, anything important, you're going to get a serious kick from behind because you think you've solved the cause and effect, except there's a piece you've left out, because it isn't just cause and effect. There are causes and effects, and they're multiple, and they're interacting with each other. But that's not what your brain wants. Your brain wants, just immediately goes for simple cause and effect. That's where your brain starts. Well, why not? As a survival technique, it's great. Do I need to think carefully about that lion's tail wiggling through the grass in terms of what it might be indicating systemically, about the location of the other troop of human beings over there a little closer, about what's happening here, about wind flow, all these things that have an impact on that lion's relationship to me. Does it matter? Or should I just think lion being eaten, we got to deal with this? Okay, which is the more effective approach? And the answer is cause and effect really works well, particularly when you're trying to deal with threats. Then the question becomes, in a complex culture like ours, where there's complex situations, are you going to be reading it properly? If you've got really complex stuff like global warming, are you ever going to understand it so you feel comfortable with it? Yeah. And then we have this problem, because everything has that moral valence, we have a terrible tendency then to ascribe a moral criteria to everything we observe. That is, when something goes wrong, it isn't just something went wrong, somebody was being bad. If something is right, it isn't something just happened and it's right, it's somebody was being right, treating you rightly. There's no such thing, morally, there's no such thing as accident. Morally, it's always somebody's goodness, somebody's badness that we're experiencing. And our brains just go there. That's our starting place. And then we have to back off from that and say, oh no, I think this is it's just a system. They didn't make me wait, especially in line at the passport office, just because it's me. They make everybody wait ridiculously, even though it looks like I've seen other people getting up there. They arrived after they're just picking on me, right? That's the way it feels. Is that what's happening? No, the person who deals with my kind of issue at the passport office, they're tied up with somebody else and I just have to wait. It's just a bureaucracy. It's not, they're picking on me. Except I think maybe they are picking on me. But that's, again, that's our brain. That's the way we're wired. So this is inherent in our brains, these built-in biases to thinking, but they're also biases to morality. They're biases to the way we perceive what is right and wrong, good and evil, all that stuff around us. Okay. That's about as far as we can go today. Didn't get as far as I wanted, but I didn't think we would. Means next class we're going to have less time to deal with our stakeholder analysis than I would like. But it is really important that we deal with this preliminary stuff before we get into the ongoing materials, because they all follow from this. Okay. Any questions, brief questions, before we pack it up for today? Go think about your brain. You try thinking about your brain. Your brain doesn't like to be thought about. But how often, when something goes wrong, do you think somebody is being bad, rather than asking first, what happened? What's the evidence? Always ask that question. What is the evidence? That's the primary point. Because you're going to do all of that stuff automatically. But what's the evidence? Why, when you see a crooked stick in the grass, do you immediately impute presence of snake? Yeah? But we're doing that all the time in everything we do around these kinds of biases.
So is it good to have some biases like this in order to, managing leader in a group? Is it good to have some those biases?
Oh, what do you think? Is it good to have those biases as a manager?
It depends on, I think. It's some of them I think it's not in our hands, and it's in our character or in our brain mind. And
Yep.
some of them I think it's not. For example, baseline anxiety. I think it's maybe having a little bit of that. It can be helpful to be a good manager. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I know. Those are really good questions to be asking. My issue is, I think when we respond emotionally in the workplace, it's usually because something is going wrong. We get a strong intuitive feeling. But what is it that's going wrong? Remember that it could well be these things. It's a perception of something. What is really happening? Let's use it as an excuse to start gathering data rather than a reason to start reacting emotionally or morally, making judgments before we've gathered information. That's what gets us into trouble. These things are all about making quick decisions. The problem is, if you're in management, your job is not to make quick decisions. Your job is to make thoughtful decisions that are relatively quick. Okay? It's a tricky trade-off. So you end up, I think, the best managers in my experience, they know that they're getting this, and then they quickly, through their experience, turn it into a relatively appropriate response. Does that have to be perfect? Because it's a system. You never know what the right answer is until after you've already tried an answer. But if you take some time to reflect on this, particularly realizing how powerfully anxiety forces us, pushes us to make decisions before or even without evidence, well, it's like anxiety is telling us something, but it isn't telling us what to do. Anxiety simply says you've got to do something. If we're not careful, well, the something is an emotional outburst or a rapid reaction or an intuitive response that fits some of these other biases without thinking through what's going on.
I think because our decisions are based on the evidence and the result, so we should use this bias in our decision as amount as they give us the good result. It's a kind of effective in our decision.
Yeah, well, the answer is correct. If we're working in an environment where it's routine, where we're getting what we expect, then working with this is just fine. We will know what we're doing. The problem is, as soon as we hit something new, our brain first tries to, as soon as something new comes, we get anxious. For good reason. Could be a threat. But that's leading us into all sorts of bad thinking processes. So and another problem that happens is sometimes we're in a situation that's new and it doesn't feel new. It feels old and routine. So we don't get the sense of anxiety when we should. So it's like we need to always be kind of reflective, saying it seems to be good, but it might not be. Okay? Or it feels bad, but it might be good. Let's just take a deep breath, think about this. And taking a deep breath is a really good way of managing all of this stuff. Though these two are so deeply embedded, you'll never get rid of them. Even if, once you've learned them. And actually, though I have to admit, there is one category of people who do not suffer from optimism bias. Really smart people do not suffer from optimism bias with regard to personal actions. Really smart people typically suffer from a pessimism bias regarding their personal actions. They know too much that can go wrong. They know that something going wrong is the most likely outcome. They conclude, therefore, that they're probably incompetent to deal with the situation. So which creates a really interesting, that the people who best understand are usually the people least capable of responding. Anyway, that's the one case where that typically doesn't work. But otherwise, we typically have this optimism bias. It's so deeply built in, we will never give it up. We think that we can do something when we should actually be running away. Anyway, that gets us about as far as we can get today. It's just after 12. Gives you a good chance for break and for lunch. Thursday, then, we will pick up. We will be looking at this. 7 structures of ethics and morals. 5 of them are assessed indirectly through the adaptive management. We'll look at that. So you should have found in your folders this morning the results from your adaptive management exercises. I tried to get them all done. If you didn't, do let me know, but they should be there. Take a look at that, try and make sense of it, because it's about the way our brains process stuff. It's not about personality. It's about the way we have learned to process our world using the organic structures of our brain. That's what that is. The 7 structures, well, 5 of them are really common. 2 of them are rare. We'll use them for ethics and morality quite a lot, but we don't normally use them for just operational decision making. So I just dropped them off. So there are people who do use them for their operational decision making, and we call them freaks and weirdos. Okay? But the other 5 are pretty standard, and we use them all the time. Okay, so we'll get a look at those. If you use the other 2 on a regular basis, you're probably not in this program. You're probably not in any program. You probably have trouble dealing with life, or you live in a convent or a monastery, and you're doing okay. Because they take you outside of stuff, or you're an artist who anyway. So there are a few that they're there, but we don't use them a lot. The other 5 we use a lot, all the time. So. Okay, any last questions? So team projects turn in? Good. And then we'll, thank you.
And I have a problem with